Hey guys, welcome back to another great game of CDH. And before the video starts, I want to thank everyone watching since the channel just hit 4,000 subscribers. I still can't believe how fast the channel has grown. And to show my appreciation, I wanted to announce a giveaway for a few lucky subscribers. And while I'm still working out the details, I should have more in the upcoming weeks, so stay tuned for that. Also, have you heard the news? Your favorite CDH YouTube channel has released some cool merch. And if you're interested in picking up some sweet new apparel, come check us out. Also, if you like what you see, consider joining our Patreon, as with your help, we can keep producing the videos you enjoy. And if you want to play with us, hop on our Discord. We have an ever-growing community that loves to talk MTG or whatever else strikes our fancy. And we would love to meet new people. Alright, block there, kill that. Oh, that is trample. Guess I'm just dead on board. Starting us off is English, who has brought Malcolm Vialsmasher. This is a traditional Grixis Turbo Nas shell, with additional win cons with Malcolm and Glinthorn Buccaneer. Additionally, Malcolm comes out super quick and can help with initial ramp needed to get off the ground in the early game. In the second spot, we have Shadow, piloting Jeska Ishai. This is a quick combo deck with the goal of assembling an infinite mana combo, or doing normal Jeskai Breach shenanigans with intuition. It has a lot of power, and when everything else fails, Ishai can one-shot players really easily, with or without the aid from Jeska. In the third spot, we have Hidden Planet X, playing Belbe. This is big mana Belbe, and is copied from the 99s list, although I guess their channel is now called Local Game Guy, which I'll have linked in the corner, as it's a great reference, and Patrick really goes into a lot of detail explaining the deck. And bringing up the rear, we have Jake on Thrasios Jeska. This is actually a budget deck that uses a variety of different combos while relying on Thrasios for card advantage and Jeska as an infinite mana outlet and needed spot removal. But without further ado, let's get on to the gameplay. Also, English mulls to 5 and Shadow to 6. English starts off with a Scalding Tarn. Shadow has a Tundra, which is used for Giver runes. Hidden plays a Forbidden Orchard and passes. Jake has a Shivan Reef and takes 1 to cast a Mystic Remora. Hidden does have a response as he casts a Worldly Tutor, giving the 1/1 Spirit to English, and Hidden finds a Thornbow Archer and the fish resolves. English plays a Volcanic and moves to combat. He sends his Spirit at Jake for 1. Shadow has a Wooded Foothills' land and also moves to combat. He sends the Giver at English, since he knows English is on Adnos. Hidden plays a basic forest and gives another Spirit to English for black mana to cast his Tutored Archer. Jake untaps and pays for his fish. He also has a basic forest and casts a Mana Crypt, ending his turn with a Sylvan Library. English unfortunately misses his land drop as he passes his turn. And at his end step, Shadow cracks his Foothills, and responding to that, English cracks his Tarn. English doesn't have any effect and just wants to save time, as he grabs an Underground Sea, while Shadow grabs a tapped Steam Vents. Shadow plays an Exotic Orchard, and while he doesn't like it, decides to feed the fish, as he casts one of his own. Hidden bolts himself when he plays an untapped Agademe, the Undercrypt. Hidden unfortunately doesn't have anything large in his hand and decides to cast a Manglehorn over his commander. English gets another Spirit, and the Manglehorn ETB destroys Jake's Mana Crypt.
Just say, English, you're gonna have an army of spirits soon.
So you can give me up to 2 more, and then I have to start using dice.
Hidden then ends his turn with combat. He has a free attack into Jake and sends the Archer his way, with the Archer's attack trigger draining the whole table for 1 life each. Jake untaps and lets his fish go. He then takes 8 to keep 2 extra cards from the Sylvan, and unfortunately it looks like he's short on lands too, as he ends his turn casting a Finhorn Elves. And at his end step, English flashes in a Spectral Sailor. English is still missing lands and decides to gamble. He gives a card to Shadow and finds a card to hand. And this truly is a gamble, as he had to randomly discard a Mana Crypt. English then moves to combat and pokes Jake with his Flyer. Shadow lets his fish go, and for 2 casts a Malevolent Hermit. Hidden plays a swamp, and still not having a need for Belbe, casts a Dothy Voidwalker.
Heard that's a good card.
Hidden still has free attacks on Jake, and sends his Archer and the Manglehorn that way. The Archer does drain the table, but Hidden is done after that. Jake Sylvans and takes another 8. He has an island as land, and casts a tapped Springleaf Drum, although Shadow now regrets not keeping that fish around for another turn. English still can't do much, as he heads the combat, and once again pings Jake with his flyer. Shadow starts off his turn with a gamble.
I don't know what I'm getting. It's probably something boring.
I don't know. You should discard whatever it is because it should be sweet.
Definitely going to be boring either way. That's not my selection. That just happens to be the top of the pile.
Oh, okay. I was going to be like, I love that you're showing us what you're...
Yeah.
I preferred the previous pick.
He ends up randomly discarding an Underworld Breach, which goes to the Dothy zone. He then follows it up with the tapped Soul Ring, and ends his turn sending his Hermit and the Giver at Jake for 3.
Just remember, you did 16 of this to yourself, Jake.
Yeah, I know.
I lost a game a few weeks ago where my own mana crypt did 30 damage to me.
Nice. I play Vintage as well, and I've lost Vintage games where I've done 21 damage to myself with mana crypts.
Hidden gives another Spirit to English and finally casts Belbe. He then moves to combat and sends the team at Jake, draining the whole table. While Jake takes a total of 7, dropping him to 4. Although not everything is smooth sailing for Hidden, as in his end of combat phase, English fires off a cleaved Alchemist Retrieval to bounce Belbe to prevent Hidden from gaining his extra mana. Jake this time doesn't take any extra cards off his Sylvan, and on his main phase casts a Pyroclasm. Shadow does debate whether or not he wants to keep his stuff by using his Hermit, but he'd still lose the Hermit to the Dothy zone regardless, and decides to let the board wipe, with Jake ending his turn with his commander Thrasios. English draws, but is still not finding his lands, as he passes the turn. Shadow has a pretty simple turn, as he casts his commander Ishai. Hidden, having already seen his board be decimated, decides to fire off a culling ritual of his own. Ishai gets a counter, and English gets a spirit off the orchard, although the spirit doesn't do much as it gets destroyed by the ritual, and Hidden gains 5 mana, 1 green and 4 black. He then recasts Belbe, giving another counter to Ishai, and follows that up with a Vamp Tutor, giving him another counter to the bird. Although Shadow then responds with the Dispel on the Vamp, and Hidden doesn't have anything else to do and passes. Jake has a pretty quick turn, just playing a River Glide Pathway. English draws and finally finds a land, as he plays a Flooded Strand, with Hidden at his end step, Deadly Rollicking, Shadow's Ishai. Shadow casts a Mana Crypt and follows it up with Imperial Recruiter. He knows what he wants as he goes looking for a Serra's Ascendant, and ends his turn shortcutting to cast it, passing while he actually searches out the card. Hidden plays a Gaia's Cradle as land and is not sure what to do. He decides on combat and sends Belbe at Jake for 2, although he chooses to take 1 instead as Jake casts a Lightning Bolt to kill Belbe, with Hidden just spending his second main recasting Belbe and giving a spirit to English. Jake draws but is in a tough spot as he casts an Incubation Druid and passes. English once again doesn't have much, with Shadow's end step Brainstorming to draw 3 and put 2 back. Shadow takes 3 from his crypt and casts a Mox Diamond. He discards a Sea of Clouds and casts his other commander Jeska. Jake is dead to it, so he responds with a Tail's End to stop the walker. Although Retribution is swift, as Shadow then sends his Ascendant back at him to take him out of the game, with Shadow on his second main gaining 4 colors from Belbe, which lets him recast Ishai as well, with the only response being Hidden casting a Nox Revival to put the Deadly Rollick back on top of his library. Hidden draws the Rollick and doesn't have anything else to do as he passes. English finds the Gemstone Caverns off the top. He then cracks his fetch to find an untapped Steam Vents. English then heads to combat and sends the Spirit at Shadow, who blocks with his Recruiter to prevent English from gaining even more mana off Belbe. And on his second main, he gains 2 colorless from Belbe and casts a Thassa's Oracle, which resolves, and responding to the trigger, English casts a Tainted Pact, exiling his library and winning him the game. And before I get to the game review, I did want to thank a special Patreon member, Elif Cruz, for his support of the channel. Game review. Well, at this point, it was anyone's game. Jake did mention he was holding a grip of interaction, but a lack of blockers meant his life total dropped before he could really stabilize. And since he was an ad nos player as well, he took the brunt of it. Although I thought Shadow was actually going to take it, at least before the Deadly Rollick. And even after that, he really was building up quite the board, if English didn't just combo off. Although he was lucky, as Hidden decided to give him all the spirits, which let him be safe from attacks. As for Hidden, the Pyroclasm really was the end for him, as he had no way to rebuild, and he even drew the Void Winnower, which was unfortunately too late, as he didn't end up having the mana to cast the creature. But it was still a great match, and as a reminder, I am a community ambassador for Monarch Media, and while I can't say anything just yet, they're back and ready to create some quality CDH tournaments and events. So if you're interested in finding out more, check the links down below. And thanks for making it to the end of the video. I'll catch you guys later, and remember, never give up, even if you're dead on board.